9 o'clock on the dot. I'm going to go ahead and get started because I'm probably going to run a little bit long and I want to respect your time, allow you to get off to other events or other things that you are doing today. Those of you that are in this class, you will be turning in the lecture question at the end of the day as usual. Also, as usual, some of these slides are a little bit text heavy. Any of you are welcome to take pictures of the slides if you feel like you want the information, don't have time to write it all down. You're welcome to have your phones out ready to get a picture. So we are talking today about Native Americans in the time period of Manifest Destiny. We'll be talking more about Manifest Destiny on Wednesday. I wanted to get the Native American side in here first. The short story is that from 1840 forward, European Americans were invading the West and were moving in huge numbers out to the West. And the kind of traditional story of Native American history told through a U.S. history lens. Come on in, we've got desks up here. Just go ahead and rearrange the desks any way that will make you comfortable. That Europeans moved out west, all the Native Americans got smallpox and died. You know, that's kind of the story. And so we look at Native American history traditionally in U.S. history using these kinds of lenses. We erase them. We say, oh, Europeans got there and then they disappeared. They just vanished. We also exoticize them, which means we give them these kind of racially based characteristics that are different and weird. They're not the same kind of humans as the Europeans are. They're exotic and romantic. And so if you have ever heard of the idea of the noble savage, that is this idea of exoticization, which is very similar to racialization. And when we talk about racialization, we are talking about giving everybody the same characteristics based on basically their physical appearance. To say, oh, well, because you have, you know, a little bit of extra melanin and long black hair, oh, therefore you love the wilderness and you have a special affinity with owls and you have these kinds of romanticized characteristics that we might apply to Native Americans, but saying that they have that because of something intrinsic within them. That's racialization. The other part of racialization is to assume that all Native Americans are the same, whether you are from an Iroquois family or from a Navajo family. You're all going to love owls the same. You're all going to want to have wide open countries around you. So it's rather than, come on in, I'm sure there's room, find, if you're near an empty desk, please wave your hand, let people know where there are seats. It's this assumption that we can talk about all Native Americans as if they are Indians. We're just going to use that sweeping word to talk about all of these different people as though they are all the same. Let's do this instead. Rather, when we talk about Native Americans in general, when we talk about Native American history, assume that Native Americans are continuous communities, that the Iroquois people near us today have a continuous history. It's hard to find the room, and now it's hard to find space. Come on in. We've got a few desks up here. You can, there's a bench over there we can sit upon. It's the assumption that they have a history today that connects them to pre-colonial times in the United States, that they are continuous communities, not disjointed, not erased, not vanishing. That these are understandable human people with human motivations, rather than looking at them as exotic others. Look at them as, hey, people whose motivations that we can understand. We don't have to think about them as being somehow weird and different. Let's look at their actions and see how they fit into our understanding of humanity. And finally, rather than saying all Native Americans are the same, we can talk about Native American religion, Native American economics, Native American society. We have to look at them as unique communities. prior to, I'll pick a number, 1776, Native Americans did not look at each other and say, oh, we're all Native Americans. They looked at other groups and said, you're really weird and different. Maybe I will trade with you, but we have different languages, different religions. We are different peoples, not a united people. It's not until around 18 teens, time of Tecumseh, that they begin to have what today we call a pan-Indian movement. So we have to look at people within their unique community contexts, not look at them as all Native Americans have this same experience. I'm going to play this video. The people that are on Zoom should know that there is no sound with the video. It makes it dramatic. It's really annoying, actually, that it has no sound. But what this video shows is how Europeans spread across the American continent from the time of colonization until 2010, I believe it ends. So it's pretty dramatic to go from controlling most of the continent to controlling virtually none of the continent. And again, now I have to see if I can move forward. Can we move forward? There we go. It's easy to write a history based on a video like that that says Europeans took the land from Native Americans, that was the end. Europeans are active in that sentence, Native Americans are losers, and that's kind of the only way that history has been written until very recently. What I want to do today is give you a more complicated picture of how that happens. One of the other classes that I teach is on frontier history, and a frontier is a place where two or more communities are contesting for control of the land. And so when we talk about the American frontier, we are talking about the place where Europeans and Native Americans were contesting for the land. And what I'm doing today is showing you the ways that 3 Native American communities fought to keep their agency and to keep their land in this time period, so that you know it wasn't this easy sweep of Europeans coming into America, but that it was something that was fought for at every step. So as that video showed you, until 1828 or so, expansion was very slow. As you know, transportation was really hard. We're dealing with bad roads and ox carts, and if you want to get somewhere quickly, you have to usually go on a waterway. That's why everybody's settled up here in the Champlain Valley. You have to dig canals. It's very, very slow. With the onset of the market economy, with the onset of industrialization and the transportation revolution, it got to be much, much easier for European Americans to expand their footprint. So the European expansion was relatively slow until we get to 1840, which is when we've got railroads and we've got extensive canals and really strong transportation networks. And then in 1842 begins the surge of migration that we would later identify as manifest destiny. And again, my class will talk about this a little bit more on Wednesday. Basically, in the 1830s, a missionary family made it across the continent and opened people's eyes to the fact that, oh, white women can actually travel across the continent. And then a whole bunch of people got excited and said, we can travel across the continent. And the first real wagon train started out in Missouri in 1842 and brought with it then a flood of European migrants wanting to take that land that's in the West. Most of the decisions to move west were done on an individual level by individual men, usually in consultation with their wives or mothers, but not always. They didn't go to Native Americans and say, please, can I have some land from you? Because of this concept of manifest destiny, the Europeans felt that they were entitled to this land, that God had given them a continent of people who were not using the land the way that the Europeans thought the land should be used. So they felt justified in simply going in and taking it over. But the Native Americans didn't just say, oh, okay, God said you can have this land. They used their cultural, what do we call it, cultural baggage, their cultural tricks, their community, and the methods and priorities that they had established as a community, they used to try to hold on to their homelands, to try to stay in the places where their ancestors had lived. We're going to look at just 3 of the hundreds of Native American communities that existed in what is today the United States. We're going to look at the Cherokee, who were one of the earliest displaced tribes in Georgia and Tennessee areas. We will look at the Comanche, who are so cool. Comanche are just super cool, and they were they were dominant in northern Texas, Oklahoma, New Mexico. Their home country was along the Arkansas River. So if you have a mental image of where the Arkansas River is, that's where the Comanche had their winter homelands, and then they spread out from there. And then lastly, we will look at the Lakota, who are in the northern part of the Great Plains, South Dakota, Nebraska, a little bit north of there. All these images, a lot of these images, just so I can fill you in, was an artist named George Catlin, who in the 1830s made it a mission to, here's that racism thing again, but it was a mission to document the vanishing natives. He said, oh, the Native Americans are vanishing, I better document their ways of life. So a lot of these really sympathetic portraits that you see of Native Americans from the 19th century come from this one artist. So we'll talk first about the Cherokee, and were some of the first Native Americans contacted by the British when they began to settle. They had contact not only with the British, but also with the Spanish. When Europeans met them, always had lived in sedentary villages. They were not nomadic. They're living in Georgia. It's pretty temperate. It's beautiful. They had so much resources available to them in the Appalachians where they lived that they didn't need to migrate. They had settled villages, they had agriculture, they had a government system that was based on consensus and equality. Men and women both joined in community discussions, and then it wasn't majority rule. It was once everybody agrees, we will go out and take an action of some kind. They were matrilineal. They were based on the same kind of clan system that most Native American groups. It's such an ancient system that the division of communities into clans transcends a lot of different Native American groups. So they were very well established in their place, and over the course of their history, you see that being in their place was more important to them than any other part of their culture. Because what we see over the course of the 18th century is progressive adaptations to the Europeans, because they want to trade with the Europeans. They want to get the cool stuff that the Europeans have to trade, like knives, metalwork, all kinds of pots. Those kinds of things were really important in trade goods. And so by the early 19th century, they had adopted a European legal system. In 1826, they write a constitution for the Cherokee Nation that is based on the United States Constitution. They adopt European economic systems, not only in trade, but they adopt slavery. They're living in an area where the primary economy is based on enslaving people to grow your cotton. They adopt that. They adopt a written language. Very famously, a man named Sequoyah created the Cherokee syllabary, which allowed them to write their native language. Why did they want to write their native language? Because Europeans respected written language. They respected the written law, and the Cherokee were ready to say, okay, yeah, we can make ourselves a European style language. They began publishing a newspaper. They wrote their laws in Cherokee. All of this so that they could convince the Europeans that, yes, we are civilized. We are taking on these trappings of what you, the Europeans, recognize as civilized, including education systems. They move away from a traditional system of parents teaching their children to a more, what we recognize as a European education system. A large portion of the Cherokee also Christianize. They convert to Christianity and hold this up as, look, we are civilized. So they were, by the 1820s, partly trading away their land. This map in close-up to be really confusing. The light-colored bit here is territory that was claimed by the Cherokee. The dark lines are chunks that were taken away throughout various treaties. This is the heartland that they remained in by the 1830s. So the problem with the Cherokee strategy of adapting was partly racism, partly that the Europeans persisted, and especially after the 1820s, they persisted in saying, well, all Native Americans want to be free and roam and be able to hunt and gather, and they don't have agriculture. They're naturally nomadic. We need to recognize their we need to recognize their natural affinity for wildness. And so they didn't see when the, so see in quotation marks, they didn't see when the Cherokee are adapting all these trappings of what the Europeans identify as civilized. The Europeans, Andrew Jackson, refused to see that they were making these changes, that they were recreating themselves in a European image. So two things are going on economically in this time period, which is Eli Whitney has invented the cotton gin, and cotton farming is exploding across the South, including in the areas where the Cherokee live. And then in 1824, gold was discovered in Cherokee territory. And it's one thing to say, well, I want that cotton field. And then it's a lot of work to put in a cotton field, but gold really makes people hungry. And so there was a land rush into Cherokee land because of going after this gold. And the Cherokee claims, even when they had paper, even when they had deeds, they had treaties, they had all of this law supporting them, the Cherokee claims were ignored. I will introduce you to a couple Native Americans, names that you should know as we move through this lecture. The first of them is John Ross. John Ross is so interesting to me because he was Cherokee, all right? He's full-on Cherokee because his mother was Cherokee, his grandmother was Cherokee, his great-grandmother was Cherokee. And as I think I mentioned, the Cherokee are matrilineal, which means it doesn't matter who your father is, you are Cherokee if your mother is Cherokee. But his father was a Scottish trader, and his grandfather was a Scottish trader, and his great-great-grandfather was a Scottish trader. And he grew up in a household that was bilingual. And when he was at home with his mother, he wore Cherokee clothes and he spoke Cherokee. And when he went trading with his father, he wore European clothes and he spoke English. And so he's able to do this thing of walking in between the worlds. And he would go on trading trips where he sets out from Cherokee country with Cherokee goods and then sheds his Cherokee-ness on the barge to become just another white guy trading and being able to pass between the worlds. So he's super interesting just for his ability to transit between these worlds. He was elected because of his strong support for the Cherokee and his ability to speak with European Americans in their, not only their own spoken language, but in their metaphorical language, in their cultural language. He's able to communicate with the Europeans. He's elected as principal chief and negotiates directly with Washington. He is sitting down with Andrew Jackson saying, no, I don't want you to take our land. And Jackson is saying, but we want your land. So he's directly communicating with the people in Washington that are trying to take the land away from the Cherokees. To one extent, he was successful, right? He was able to hold on to this land until 1838, which is 8 years after the Removal Act was passed. He was able to negotiate payments for the Cherokee, not only giving them land in the West, but getting payments for them. The Cherokee remain one of the strongest nations in Oklahoma today because of the land claims that they were able to get thanks to John Ross's negotiations. But you will notice that I said Oklahoma and not Georgia and Tennessee. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 was spearheaded by Andrew Jackson, saying, we're going to get all Indians, as they said it, get all Indians out of the East and move them to an equivalent amount of acreage in the West. So you give me an acre of land in Georgia, I'll give you an acre of land in Oklahoma. Today we can look at those and say, well, those aren't equivalent at all. But that's the way the law was written. And while the Indian Removal Act said that these removals would be voluntary, they were not intended to be voluntary. They were going to pressure the Native Americans to such an extent that they would leave voluntarily, and if they didn't, they ended up getting pushed out through the military. The Cherokee, led by John Ross, resisted through the law. They did not resist with open rebellion. They did not resist with economic boycotts. They resisted through the law, and they went to court. First, the Cherokee Nation took Georgia to court, saying, this is our land, we have a treaty, we're not going to give it up to you. And the Supreme Court in Cherokee Nation versus Georgia said the Cherokee don't have standing. The Cherokee are not part of the United States, therefore they cannot sue Georgia, sorry. So the second case is Worcester versus Georgia. Worcester was a missionary, a white man who was in Cherokee country working with the Cherokee, and he brought suit on behalf of the Cherokee Nation. He had standing. And the Supreme Court in that decision said, yes, the Cherokee have legal title to their land. The Cherokee are allowed to remain where they are. And then both the president and the state of Georgia said, well, we don't really care. We don't really care what the Supreme Court says. We're going to drive the Cherokee out anyway. And that led, again, I'm covering this very quickly, it led to 1838 when Andrew Jackson's successor, Martin Van Buren, sent in the military to move the Cherokee off this land. And it literally was the Cherokee, or the Cherokee are dinner plowing their fields, and the soldiers came in and said, it's time to go now. No, don't bother getting blankets. You have, yes, you can pick up the kids, but that's it. And they were moved from their land in Georgia and Tennessee, first to a concentration camp in kind of the Missouri-Illinois nexus. And it was literally a concentration camp, meaning that we're trying to concentrate a population, bring them together. And then once they had gathered what they thought was the entire population of the Cherokee, they moved them, beginning in October, they moved them on foot out to Oklahoma. The casualties on that journey were about 25%. The numbers kept were not very good, but the historians estimate about 25% of the people who left the concentration camp died before they arrived in Oklahoma. That is known as the Trail of Tears. Oftentimes you will see the Trail of Tears wrapped up into all Indian removal. So they start talking about the Choctaw and the Kiowa and other Native people who were removed. You want to get technical, Trail of Tears applies to the Cherokee journey. That doesn't make the other removals less awful. It's just a historical technicality. So the Cherokee strategy was to play the game on the European field, to take the European ideas, adopt them, and try to convince the Europeans that they should belong. It was not a successful, well, was it a successful strategy? It was a strategy. They tried it, they were displaced. with the exception of the Native Americans of the Cherokee, who weren't caught up in that rap, and they still have they still have a viable Eastern Cherokee Nation in, I believe it's North Carolina. All right, the second group that I want to talk about is the Comanche. Because they're just so tough. The Comanche are so cool. The Comanche came from somewhere else. And so here's the thing. I said at the beginning that Native American communities are continuous communities that go back through time. But that does not make them ahistorical. It doesn't mean that there has always been a Comanche people. And if you go to, I don't know, you go to that point in 1400, you're going to find a Comanche there. The Comanche people were descended from the Shoshone people, who the Shoshone people were up north, and a bunch of Shoshone for some reason said, yeah, I think I'll go south. And they came down and they became Comanche. We don't know all of the ways that Native American groups were formed because we haven't listened to the oral histories that told those stories. But you can't assume that because someone today identifies as being a particular group, that their ancestors all the way back belong to that particular group, because these communities were fluctuating and changing in the same way that communities can today. So anyway, we know that the Cherokees appear in around 1550, that they are a part of, that they are descended from these Shoshone people, and they begin to have Spanish contact from around the 1600s. They've come down here and begun to interact with the Spanish that are moving north out of Mexico. And they are not particularly interested in much that the Spanish have to offer, with the exception of horses and firearms. In 1670-something, 1680, there was a massive Pueblo uprising in over here. I'm not going to say a place because I've forgotten. But there's the Pueblo uprising. It's super famous. As a result of that, a whole bunch of Spanish people were killed and Spanish colonies were abandoned. The Spanish horses went off into the grasslands. And the Comanche said, ooh, horses, that's pretty cool. And they adopted horses at that point and became some of the best horsemen in the United States. What is today the United States, in America. They became fantastic horsemen, and not only good with riding horses, and those of you that are in my class, we have that illustration of the Comanche breaking a wild horse recently, but they became excellent horse breeders, because here we've got the Arkansas River here. These river bottoms were excellent places for overwintering pregnant mares, and the reproduction rate of horses in the Comanche territory was much, much higher than it was as you get further north, and it gets harder for a mare to overwinter and carry her foal to term. So they began to trade in horses, and they developed an economy that was based on horse-based buffalo hunting. So now they have a dual economy that is based on breeding horses, trading horses, using the horses to hunt the buffalo, then getting everything else they need from the buffalo. So they're getting their meat, and they're getting their housing, and they're getting their tools and their implements, and everything they need they're getting from the buffalo, with the exception of carbohydrates. They do not have significant agriculture. Most of their food supply comes from the buffalo, and you really need to get some carbohydrates. So that was what they traded the horses for, was for wheat, was for corn, was for whatever carbohydrates they could get from surrounding groups, like the Apache, like the Navajo, like the Spanish. They're taking is trade taking advantage? They are engaging with their neighbors in order to trade for the carbohydrates that they need. And they are picking up firearms wherever they can because it's a super efficient way to kill buffalo. And so they are always trying to get new and better firearms so that they can improve their hunting. So they became physically dominant in their home region. So they're centered there in the Arkansas River, and they then spread out into Texas. They spread out into New Mexico, and are because of their prowess on the horse, because of their firearms, Because they are well organized, they are able to attack the Apache, they're able to attack Spanish colonists, they're able to attack anybody they feel is threatening them within their territory. They engaged in trade primarily in horses and in captives. So they would go off to Texas and raid Spanish settlements in Texas, capture horses there, capture people there, women and children there, bring them back into their home territory. The women and children would be set to processing buffalo hides, and then the excess horses and the buffalo hides are taken off to New Mexico and traded with the Spanish in New Mexico. The Spanish, and then later the Mexicans, did not really realize they're dealing with the same group of people. Or, and put the other way, the Comanche didn't really care that they were trading with the same group of people. To them, horses are in Texas, we want to get horses to New Mexico. They're doing this trade both sides against the Spanish and the Mexicans. They were so effective at this that they prevented Spanish settlement. One of the reasons that the Southwest was so sparsely settled was that, by Europeans, was that the Comanche were in there raiding and trading and really dominating this central part of the continent. It's one of the reasons that the Mexicans were then willing to say, okay, you can take that after the Mexican War, because the Mexicans had been unable to control that region due to the Comanche. So we will talk specifically about a Comanche person as well. This whole economic system that I was just describing was described as the Comanche Empire in a book by that name by an author with a complex Finnish name that I've never been able to pronounce. Their first name is Pekka, P-E-K-K-A. The second name begins with an H, has lots of umlauts. So look for the book Comanche Empire. It's super interesting. But I want to tell you about Cynthia Ann Parker there, who was captured at age 9 from one of the last major Comanche raids in Texas, was raised with the Comanche. John Wayne made a movie about her. The Searchers is based on the story of Cynthia Ann Parker. Her child was named Quanah Parker. This is her daughter Prairie Flower. That is not Quanah. Quanah Parker became known as the last chief of the Comanche. When Quanah was 12 years old, the Searchers arrived and took Cynthia back to the Parkers, where she pined away and died. She did not want to stay with her European family, but was forced to. And Quanah Parker led the military defense of their territory. And the military defense was through, the cavalry. And then the Comanche were better horsemen than the Europeans were. They were better able to maintain their horses. Their horses were better situated, better adapted for the territory than the European horses were. And so the Comanche could ride in and decimate a little squad of American soldiers and ride away again. The way that the Europeans finally dominated the Comanche was horrible, was by killing their ponies. They said, hey, we'll stop attacking the Native Americans, let's attack their ponies. And they slaughtered a remuda of 1,200 horses at once. And then the Comanche couldn't get around anymore. Simultaneously, they were decimating the buffalo. Partly that was for industrial purposes, because buffalo hide is really good at making fan belts and things like that. But primarily it was to undercut Native American economies. So the Comanche, led by Quanah, lost territory to the European encroachments. They were not militarily defeated until 1875, when it became both difficult for them to maintain the horses that they need and impossible for them to feed themselves because of the decimation of the buffalo. And ultimately Quanah Parker surrendered, was able to cut himself a deal, got a big ranch, remained a political leader of the Comanche people in Oklahoma for the remainder of his life into the early 20th century. there's so many things I could say, but I need to move on. So the Comanche strategy was selectively taking, especially technology that the Europeans introduced. The horse, we'll call the horse technology, the firearms, and using it to enhance and develop their own priorities. The basing themselves on horse and buffalo culture. They were not adopting European ways of life. They were taking tools from the Europeans that were useful to them, and using it to maintain their territory. And now our last group that we'll talk about today are specifically the Lakota Sioux. The Sioux is a very large language group with at least 3 divisions, the Lakota, Dakota, and the third one, which was in my head a second ago, and now it's gone. But it's got different language differences. There are different kinds of Sioux people, and of course, Sioux is a French term for these people. One of the reasons we have a French name for the Sioux is the Lakota and the Sioux kind of consolidated themselves into a new people as the Europeans are pushing west, and they're pushing the Iroquois, pushing other people west. They're pushing the next people along further west. And in the early 1700s, a group of people appear in Montreal talking to the French saying, hey, we want to trade with you. And those people got the name of the Sioux. And they were a group of allied but not necessarily related individuals who formed this group. And what you see in the Lakota throughout the 19th century is a real openness about who is a part of the group, and a desire to establish relationships that are going to lead themselves to trade. So language around trade often has family connections. Because we are brothers, we're going to do this exchange. A lot of the Lakota social strategy is family construction. They're going to build families, and it's much more of what we think about as a chosen family today, rather than a blood-connected family, which in part is emblematic of the kinds of disruption that were brought on Native Americans by European colonization in the first place, that we have a bunch of people who are strains from decimated groups that are coming together to form their own group. So again, like the Comanche, the Lakota have a history of a time when there wasn't a Lakota, and they then formed this group. So they migrated into the West. The group of Lakota that we're concerned about today end up in those upper Great Plains, as I was telling you about. They also adopted horses as they got there. They're doing less horse breeding, and their claim to fame is being super at warfare on horseback. And the Lakota strategy is very much of a raid and dominance. They're not trying. If they were planets, like planets clear their orbit, that's how you know they're a planet. Lakota were not trying to do that. They're not trying to drive people out of their territory. They want to dominate people within their territory. So as we cross over the upper Great Plains, it's all Lakota territory, but there are also Crow, and there are Kira, and there are these people, and there are those people, different villages of different groups that might pay tribute to the Lakota, are periodically attacked by the Lakota, but the Lakota are not trying to drive them away. They're trying to collect tribute. What the Lakota wanted was to control the rivers. Sorry, I have to see what my next slide is, so I know if I switch. I don't know. It's perfect, yes. They want to control the rivers because, as I said, if you want to travel in the 19th century, you've got to do it on water. And they don't have roads. They're barely building railroads. So you need to be traveling on the waterways. And what the Lakota wanted was trade. They want the fabrics and the pots and the beads and all the photographs. They want all the stuff, the horse fixings, all the things that they could get from the Europeans. The Lakota really wanted that. So their whole strategy is based on meeting up with the Europeans, scaring the Europeans enough that they're going to trade with them, but then engaging in trade. That's why they're getting this tribute from the other tribes that are around them. is because they're not sitting around weaving handicrafts. They're not sitting around doing stuff. They need to get trade goods from the other people that they dominate that they can then trade to the Europeans to get the stuff that they want. So again, it's a very, very different strategy than the other groups that we have talked about. And they want treaties with the United States. They know that the United States is the dominant political organization. They don't want to go to war with these people. They want recognition of their rights and they want trade, and trade comes with treaties. So they are actively pursuing getting a treaty with the United States to protect their rights to territory and trade. There are lots of cool Lakota that we can talk about. I didn't put Crazy Horse in this lecture. I don't know why. He's also very cool. But we'll talk about Sitting Bull because he was not a warrior. Crazy Horse was a fantastic warrior that led his people into battle. Sitting Bull was a visionary, and Hunk Papa is a group of Lakota. Remember, there are all these groups that have been glued together into one big group. So Hunk Papa was just his particular band of the Lakota. And Sitting Bull had the vision of how to establish the Lakota as a people, to bring all of the council fires together, the 7 council fires of these different groups, bring them together to work as a collective in order to establish the power of the Lakota. And then he was also the leader of some of the last Lakota who lived off the reservation. So he and Crazy Horse together were at the Battle of Wounded Knee, where General George Custer was slaughtered along with all his minions. It was a great high point for the Lakota, but because they had destroyed the American cavalry, it really put a target on their backs, and the American cavalry became determined to destroy the military capability of the Lakota. And so they chased Sitting Bull and his band all the way to Canada. And then I guess it got cold. Now that's really, that is rude of me to say they left because it just got cold. But they got to Canada and they were exhausted and sick, and they were captured and brought back to reservations. The issue that developed with the Lakota was not that they hated all Europeans or even that they had a contiguous territory that they wanted to maintain. But they had a treaty beginning in 1851. They had the Treaty of Fort Laramie that said Lakota will get basically tolls. They can collect stuff from the people that are crossing their territory. And the Lakota, as long as they could get some cattle, get some trade goods, get some things from the migrants who were crossing their territory, they had no problem with having American migrants cross their territory. But they expected that all of those Americans would not settle in the middle of the buffalo grounds, please, and that they would actually pay tribute as they crossed. The problem was that the United States could certainly make these agreements and sign this treaty, but as I told you at the beginning, Manifest Destiny was about a bunch of individual men making decisions. It was just individual guys saying, I'm going to go out there. And they didn't care about, speeding tickets, the kinds of laws that we don't care about. We're gonna break the law when we're driving, and we're gonna break the law because I'm gonna smoke a little pot that I didn't buy legally, and we're just gonna do these things because we want to. And that's very much what the men leading this Manifest Destiny migration did. Like, I'm an American man, I get to do the things that I want to. And I don't want to give my cattle to that Native American. I don't want to not settle in this beautiful territory. I want to do my thing. So the people migrating did not comply with the agreements that had been made with the Lakota. And the Lakota complained about this. When the Lakota, it gets a little complex. The part of the treaty also involved a designated Lakota reservation, that there was a place that was theirs, and they would go there in the winter to collect the food that the federal government provided in the winter, And then during the summer, they would head out and roam all of their old traditional territory, hunting buffalo and living off the land. So they were making use of this reservation system. So again, they're using the things that the Europeans are offering. They're not necessarily resisting. They're trying to cooperate with them and live while maintaining their way of life. The problem became during the American Civil War. The federal government kind of forgot to send food to the reservations, so there were some very hungry years in the early 1860s, and the Lakota and other Sioux groups resisted by attacking European settlements. And then there was the battle against Custer that I already told you about that resulted in their final military defeat in 1881. The reason that when you have a stereotypical view of an Indian in your head today, and you've got the big feather headdress and the horse and the plains, is because the Lakota were the last significant group to be subdued by the American military. And we practically got movie pictures by 1881. So when they began making actual movies and making actual Westerns, the Native Americans that were still available to become extras in those Westerns were the Lakota. And so this popular image of Indians as looking like these Plains Indians with the headdress was because of the length of time that the Lakota survived. So the Lakota strategy was much more opportunistic, is not a good word, but it was really accepting of the fact that the Europeans are here, that the Americans are going to dominate the continent. Let's try to keep our niche within this system. Let's accept the fact that the Americans are here and use the tools that we have to try to secure our place rather than keeping the people out, rather than giving up our culture. Let's see how we can work with them. And there were a lot of things from the Europeans that the Lakota really wanted to have. So what that brings us to, this is about where the time period that we end, around 1860. And just to circle back to the beginning ideas, whenever a European American man was moving west, he was doing it in the face of Native Americans who wanted to keep their territory. And the Native Americans didn't just all tip over and die of smallpox. They had a lot of really complicated ways, and every individual community had different strategies that they used to try to maintain control of their own way of life. Just link back, Black Solidarity Day, social justice. For historians, social justice is having a complicated history. It's understanding that every person has their own human reactions to things, that it's not that all people did this or all Indians were like that. It's having this complex understanding of the past that honors the humanity and desires of everybody involved. There we are. Thank you very much.